In the heart of a harsh winter, the snow fell like a silent army invading the streets and alleys of the city. It was on such a night that I found myself alone in an old apartment building, its corridors echoing with the ghosts of long-gone tenants. The building, an aging relic from the 1920s, stood isolated in a forgotten part of town, its neighbors long since demolished or abandoned. I had moved in just a week ago, seeking solitude and a place to clear my head after a tumultuous year. The apartment, on the top floor, offered a panoramic view of the snow-covered city, a landscape both beautiful and desolate. That night, the snowstorm intensified, disconnecting me from the outside world. The city's incessant hum was muffled, replaced by the sound of wind howling through the skeletal trees. The building creaked and groaned as if protesting the weight of the snow. I wrapped myself in a blanket, trying to shake off an inexplicable feeling of unease. There was something unsettling about being the only soul in a building meant for hundreds. The silence was oppressive, broken only by the occasional groan of old pipes or the whisper of wind through the cracks. I decided to make a cup of tea, hoping it would calm my nerves. As I waited for the water to boil, I glanced out the kitchen window. The snow was falling so thickly that it formed a nearly impenetrable white curtain obscuring the world beyond. It was then that I heard it, a faint, irregular tapping sound. At first I thought it was just the building settling, but the rhythm was too deliberate, too consistent. Tap, tap, tap. The sound seemed to be coming from the hallway outside my apartment. My heart raced as I considered the possibilities. Could someone else be in the building? I had not seen another soul since I moved in. The landlord had assured me the building was mostly empty, save for a few storage units on the lower floors. Gathering my courage, I opened the door a crack, peering into the dimly lit hallway. The fluorescent lights flickered, casting eerie shadows on the peeling wallpaper. The tapping sound had stopped, replaced by a chilling silence. I stepped out, the floorboards creaking under my feet. The hallway stretched out before me, a narrow passage flanked by closed doors. Each door seemed to hide its own secrets, its own silent stories. As I walked, I noticed something odd. The number of doors didn't seem to match my memory of the building's layout. There were too many stretching on impossibly far. I reached the end of the hallway, where a large, ornate mirror hung. Its surface was tarnished, the silver backing peeling away to reveal the darkness beneath. As I looked into the mirror, a shiver ran down my spine. My reflection was there, but behind me, the hallway was different. It was longer, the doors more numerous, and at the very end, there was movement, a shadow, barely perceptible, shifting in the darkness. I spun around, my heart pounding, but the hallway behind me was empty. When I looked back at the mirror, the shadow was gone. Panic set in, and I rushed back to my apartment, locking the door behind me. I tried to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, a figment of my imagination fueled by the isolation and the storm. I retreated to the living room, trying to lose myself in a book. But the sense of unease persisted. The building seemed to be breathing around me, its old bones settling with an almost sentient intention. The wind outside howled with increasing ferocity, as if trying to communicate a desperate warning. As the hours passed, the temperature in the apartment dropped. The heating, it seemed, had stopped working. I piled on more blankets, but the cold seeped in, unrelenting. My breath formed clouds in the air, and I could see my own shivering reflection in the dark windows. Then the lights flickered and went out, plunging me into darkness. The only illumination came from the dim, ghostly light, filtering through the snow-covered windows. I fumbled for my phone, its screen a small island of light in a sea of darkness. I decided to call the landlord, but as I dialed, I heard it again, the tapping. This time it was louder, more urgent. It was coming from inside my apartment, from the direction of the bedroom. With my heart in my throat, I crept towards the bedroom, the phone clutched tightly in my hand. The tapping grew louder with each step, a Morse code of dread that seemed to be beckoning me. I reached the bedroom door, its surface cold to the touch. Taking a deep breath, I pushed it open. The room was bathed in the pale, eerie light from the window, the snow outside casting strange patterns on the walls. And there on the window was the source of the tapping. A branch from the old tree outside, its limbs weighed down by snow, was hitting against the glass. Relief washed over me, and I laughed at my own foolishness. It was just a tree, nothing more. But as I turned to leave, I saw it. A figure standing in the corner of the room, barely visible in the dim light. It was still and silent, its features obscured by shadows. My heart stopped. I couldn't move, couldn't scream. The figure remained motionless, as if waiting. I blinked. And in that moment, the figure vanished. I ran from the room, from the apartment, down the endless hallway with its too many doors. The building seemed to twist and turn around me, a labyrinthine maze with no escape. Outside, the snowstorm raged, a whiteout that swallowed the world. I was alone in an old apartment building, trapped in a night of endless terror, the storm outside mirroring the storm within. The storm outside raged with an unrelenting fury, as if the heavens themselves were unleashing their wrath upon the earth. Inside, the old apartment building seemed to come alive with a malevolent energy, its corridors twisting and turning in impossible ways. I ran, my breath ragged, my heart pounding a frantic rhythm. The endless hallway stretched before me, the doors multiplying, each one whispering secrets and silent screams. The flickering lights cast grotesque shadows that danced and writhed on the walls. I could hear the wind howling, a mournful lament that seemed to speak my name. In my panic, I lost track of direction. The layout of the building no longer made sense. Staircases led to dead ends, doors opened onto brick walls, and windows revealed only impenetrable darkness. It was as if the building itself was reshaping, becoming a maze designed to trap me. I stumbled into a room I didn't recognize. It was an old library, the shelves lined with dusty books, their spines cracked and faded. The air was thick with the smell of mildew and old paper. In the center of the room stood a large desk, an antique lamp casting a dim pool of light. On the desk lay an open journal, its pages yellowed with age. Driven by an inexplicable compulsion, I approached and began to read. The handwriting was elegant but frantic, the words of someone driven to the edge of madness. The journal belonged to a former tenant, a reclusive man who spoke of strange occurrences within the building. Noises in the night, shifting walls, and a pervasive sense of being watched. The more I read, the more the room seemed to close in around me. The air grew colder and the shadows darker. I felt a presence, as if someone or something was in the room with me, just out of sight. I slammed the journal shut and rushed out, the words echoing in my mind. The building was no mere structure. It was a living entity, a repository of the fears and nightmares of all who had dwelled within its walls. The corridors twisted and turned, leading me in circles. Time lost meaning. The storm outside a relentless symphony that played on my nerves. I felt a growing sense of despair, the realization that I might never escape this nightmarish labyrinth. Then, amidst the chaos, I heard a sound, a child's laughter, clear and innocent. It seemed out of place in this den of horrors. I followed the sound, drawn to it like a moth to a flame. The laughter led me to a small hidden door at the end of a narrow corridor. It was barely noticeable, camouflaged against the peeling wallpaper. I opened it, revealing a staircase spiraling downward into darkness. With each step, the laughter grew louder, more tangible. The staircase seemed to descend forever, the darkness an all-consuming void. Finally, I reached the bottom, emerging into a vast underground chamber. The chamber was lit by an eerie, phosphorescent glow that emanated from the walls themselves. In the center of the chamber stood a stone pedestal, and on it, a single ancient book. The laughter had stopped, replaced by a deafening silence. I approached the pedestal, a sense of dread growing with each step. The book was bound in leather, its cover adorned with strange symbols. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and opened it. The pages were filled with archaic runes and disturbing illustrations that seemed to move and change as I looked at them. The words, in a language I did not understand, whispered in my mind, a chorus of voices that filled the chamber. Suddenly, the room began to shake, the walls cracking as the building above groaned in protest. I realized then that the book was the heart of the building, the source of the malevolence that had consumed it. I knew what I had to do. With a surge of determination, I tore the pages from the book, ripping them to shreds. The building screamed, a sound that was both human and inhuman. The chamber collapsed around me, the world imploding into darkness. I awoke to silence. The storm had passed, and the first light of dawn was creeping through the windows. I was lying in the hallway outside my apartment, the old building quiet and still. I stood, my body aching, my mind struggling to comprehend what had happened. The building seemed normal, just an old structure of brick and mortar. But I knew better. I had seen its true face, had felt its dark heart. I gathered my belongings and left the apartment building, vowing never to return. The city was waking up, the snow a pristine blanket that covered the scars of the night. As I walked away, I couldn't shake the feeling that the building was watching me, its windows like unblinking eyes. I knew that the horror I had experienced would stay with me, a haunting memory of the night I spent alone in an apartment building during a snowy night, a night of terror and revelation. And so I walked into the dawn, leaving behind the echoes of laughter and the whispers of the old building, its secrets buried but not forgotten. Snowflakes drifted lazily through the beam of my headlights as I navigated the twisting, snow-covered roads to deliver a pizza to an address that seemed to exist in the middle of nowhere. I'd been a pizza delivery guy for a few years, but this order was unusual. An old, nearly forgotten town, a good hour's drive from the pizzeria. The boss said the customer paid a hefty tip in advance, so here I was, driving through a thickening blizzard, trying to find a place that wasn't even on the map. The town, when I finally found it, looked like a forgotten relic from a bygone era. The houses, barely visible through the swirling snow, were old and weather-beaten. The streets were deserted. The only sound was the howling wind that seemed to whisper secrets from the past. I checked the address again and pulled up in front of a decrepit house at the edge of the town. Stepping out of the warmth of my car, I immediately regretted not wearing an extra layer. The cold bit into my skin, and the wind seemed to cut through me. Clutching the pizza, I trudged up to the front door. I hesitated, a sense of unease washing over me. The house seemed to stare back at me with dark, hollow eyes, the windows broken, the paint peeling. I knocked on the door, expecting no response, but to my surprise, it creaked open slightly. "Pizza delivery," I called out, my voice sounding small and hesitant. There was no answer. Pushing the door open further, I stepped inside, the floorboards groaning under my weight. The interior of the house was as eerie as the exterior. Dust and cobwebs adorned every corner, and the furniture was old and worn. It felt like stepping into a time capsule, untouched by the modern world. I called out again, but the silence that greeted me was almost suffocating. A sudden gust of wind slammed the door shut behind me, causing me to jump. My heart raced, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck standing up. I turned back to the door, intending to leave the pizza and get out of there. But then I noticed something odd. Footprints in the dust leading deeper into the house. Curiosity, or maybe it was the determination to complete my job, propelled me forward. I followed the footprints down a narrow hallway, lined with old family portraits that seemed to watch me with unseen eyes. The air was thick with the scent of decay and something else, something metallic. The footprints led me to a large, dimly lit room at the end of the hallway. It looked like it might have been a living room once, but now it was just a shell of its former self. A grand, broken chandelier hung from the ceiling, and in the center of the room, a large, ornate rug lay covered in dust. But it was what was on the rug that stopped me dead in my tracks. A circle, drawn with what looked like salt, and inside the circle a single chair facing away from me. On the chair, a phone, off the hook. The dull drone of a dial tone filled the room. My skin crawled with a sense of dread. This wasn't right. I should have left then, but instead, I found myself drawn to the chair, to the phone. As I reached out to pick it up, a chill ran down my spine. The temperature in the room had dropped significantly, and I could see my breath misting in the air. I put the phone to my ear, and the dial tone abruptly stopped. Silence, then a faint whisper, almost inaudible. I strained to hear, and as I did, the whisper grew louder, turning into a cacophony of voices, all speaking at once in a language I couldn't understand. I dropped the phone and it clattered to the floor, the voices abruptly stopping. My heart pounded in my chest and a sense of panic washed over me. I needed to get out now. I turned to leave, but the room seemed to spin around me, the shadows stretching and twisting into grotesque shapes. I stumbled back, tripping over the rug, and fell hard on the floor. As I tried to get up, I realized that the circle of salt had been broken when I fell. A cold gust of wind swept through the room, and the shadows seemed to converge towards the broken circle, swirling around it in a frenzied dance. I scrambled to my feet, my only thought to escape this nightmare. I ran back through the hallway, the portraits seeming to leer at me as I passed. I reached the front door and threw it open, the wind and snow hitting me in the face. As I stumbled out into the night, I looked back at the house one last time. What I saw in the upper window made my blood run cold. A figure, just a silhouette against the dim light, standing and watching me. And then, as quickly as it appeared, it vanished into the darkness of the house. I didn't stop to think. I ran to my car, threw the pizza inside, and drove away from that forsaken town as fast as I could, not stopping until I reached the safety of the pizzeria. I told my boss what happened, but I could tell he didn't believe me. He just chuckled and said it must have been the blizzard playing tricks on my mind. But I know what I saw, what I felt. That town, that house, they were wrong. There was something there, something ancient and malevolent, and it knew I was there. I never delivered to that address again, and I hope to never find myself on those snow-covered roads leading to that ghost town. But sometimes on cold winter nights, I still hear the whispers, and I can't help but wonder what was in that house, waiting in the shadows. The days following my encounter at the ghost town were filled with unease. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of whispers just beyond the edge of hearing. My dreams were haunted by shadows and indistinct figures standing in the windows of old, decaying houses. I tried to convince myself it was just stress, the after effects of a frightening experience, but a part of me knew it was something more. I found myself driving past the road that led to the town several times, a morbid curiosity gnawing at me. Each time I told myself I'd turn in, face my fears, find answers. But as soon as the turnoff came into view, an overwhelming sense of dread filled me, and I drove past. One evening, a few weeks after the incident, I was closing up the pizzeria when the phone rang. An odd occurrence, as it was well past our regular hours. Hesitantly, I answered. The line crackled, and then that same indistinct whispering I'd heard in the house filled my ear. I slammed the phone down, my heart racing. But as I did, I noticed something that made my blood turn cold. The caller ID showed the same number that had ordered the pizza to the ghost town. I couldn't leave it alone after that. I needed answers. I did some research on the town, digging through old archives and records. What I found only deepened the mystery. The town had been abandoned in the early 1900s after a series of unexplained incidents. People disappearing, strange sightings, and a pervasive sense of fear that drove everyone away. The next day, driven by a need to understand, I found myself on the road to the town again. This time I didn't drive past. The town loomed in the late afternoon light, shadows long and deep. I parked in front of the same house, its windows like dark, watching eyes. As I approached the house, a strange sense of déjà vu washed over me. The door was ajar, just as it had been before. Inside, the dust and silence enveloped me like a shroud. I walked down the hallway, past the watching portraits, to the living room. The room was as I remembered it. The chair, the rug, the broken circle of salt. The phone lay on the floor where I'd dropped it. I picked it up, half expecting the whispering to start again, but there was only silence. I began to examine the room more closely, looking for anything that might explain what this place was, what had happened here. As I did, I noticed something I hadn't before, a trap door under the rug, partially hidden. My hands shook as I pulled back the rug and opened the trap door. A set of narrow wooden stairs descended into darkness. I hesitated, the fear almost overwhelming, but the need for answers pushed me forward. I descended, the air growing colder with each step. At the bottom was a small, dimly lit room. Shelves lined the walls, filled with old books, jars containing unidentifiable substances, and strange arcane symbols were drawn on the floor. In the center of the room was a table, on it a journal. I picked up the journal, my hands trembling. It belonged to someone who had lived in the house, a person who had been experimenting with something beyond their understanding. They wrote of voices, of shadows moving in the night, of a presence in the house that grew stronger with each passing day. The final entry was frantic, almost illegible. The writer spoke of a ritual, of trying to close a door they had unwittingly opened. They feared they were too late, that something had come through, something that was now part of the house. I felt a chill run down my spine as I read the words. The shadows in the corners of the room seemed to grow darker, more menacing. I realized then that whatever had been unleashed in this house was still here, bound to it, and perhaps to me as well. I left the journal and hurried back up the stairs, the feeling of being watched intensifying. I emerged from the house into the fading light of dusk. As I got into my car, I glanced back at the house one last time. In the window, I saw a figure standing, Not the indistinct shadow from before, but a clear, unmistakable silhouette. It was watching me, its gaze following me as I drove away. Since that day, I haven't been able to shake the feeling that something followed me back from that house. I see shadows flicker at the edge of my vision, hear whispers in the silence of the night. I know I should be terrified, but part of me is fascinated, drawn to the mystery and darkness of that forsaken place. The ghost town and the house remain a mystery, a haunting presence in my life. I don't know if I'll ever find the answers I'm looking for, or if I even want to. But one thing is certain. I can't escape the feeling that the story isn't over, that there's something more waiting for me in the shadows of that abandoned town. In the heart of a sprawling estate, nestled among skeletal trees and engulfed by a relentless winter, stood Winter's Grove Manor, a place I had come to call both my sanctuary and prison. I, Thomas Haverford, had served as the butler of this manor for more years than I cared to count. The snow-laden landscape, a silent witness to my solitude, mirrored the icy grip that seemed to clutch my heart each night. It was on such a night, as the wind howled like a banshee through the corridors, that I began my nightly rounds. The ticking of the grandfather clock in the hall was my only companion, its rhythmic heartbeat a reminder of the time slipping away in this ancient house. The owners, Lord and Lady Wintersgrove, had long since abandoned the manor, leaving me its sole caretaker. My first task was always to ensure the doors were bolted and the windows sealed against the biting cold. As I made my way through the dimly lit halls, the shadows seemed to dance and flicker in the candlelight, playing tricks on my ease. I told myself it was just the wind, just the old house settling, but a part of me couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. I reached the library, a vast room filled with musty books and heavy drapes that billowed slightly, as if breathing in the chill air. The fireplace lay dormant, its ashes long cold. It was here that I first heard it, a whisper so faint I thought it might have been the rustling of pages. But there it was again, a hushed, raspy voice calling my name, Thomas. I spun around, my heart racing, but the room was empty. Just the books, the shadows, and me. I scolded myself for being so easily spooked. After all, who would be here, in the dead of night, in a forgotten manor? My duties took me next to the dining hall, with its grand table that had once hosted lavish feasts, but now lay bare, dust settling on the fine china like a mournful shroud. The chandelier overhead creaked as it swayed gently, its crystals casting eerie reflections on the walls. As I crossed the room, the floorboards groaned beneath my feet, a lonesome sound that echoed through the empty hall. Ascending the grand staircase to the upper floors, the feeling of unease grew stronger. The portraits of the Wintersgrove ancestors seemed to follow me with their eyes, their painted expressions twisted in silent screams or mocking grins. I could almost hear their whispered accusations, blaming me for the manor's decay. I entered the master bedroom, intending to check the windows. The room was shrouded in darkness, save for the moonlight that spilled through the frost-covered glass. I approached the window, and that's when I saw it. A figure standing in the garden below, staring up at the house. It was motionless, a dark silhouette against the white snow. My breath caught in my throat. Was it real, or just a trick of the light? Shaken, I hurried to finish my rounds, my footsteps quick and uneven. I descended to the ground floor, making my way to the back of the house where the old servants' quarters lay. This part of the manor was colder, less welcoming, a stark contrast to the relative warmth of the main house. As I opened the door to the servants' hall, a draft of icy air greeted me, carrying with it a scent of decay. The room was in disarray, chairs overturned, cobwebs adorning the corners like grotesque decorations. And there, in the center of the room, was a rocking chair, moving ever so slightly, as if recently vacated. I approached it, my mind racing with explanations. Perhaps a window had been left open, or an animal had found its way inside. But as I neared, the rocking ceased abruptly, as though an unseen occupant had risen at my approach. A chill ran down my spine, and I could feel the hairs on the back of my neck stand on end. It was then that I heard it again, the whisper, closer this time, a sinister hiss that seemed to come from all around me. "Thomas, why are you here?" The voice was filled with malice, a stark contrast to the gentle calling I'd heard earlier. I turned to flee, but my way was blocked by a sudden gust of wind that slammed the door shut with a deafening bang. Panic seized me, my heart pounding in my ears as I fumbled with the doorknob, my hands shaking. The air grew colder, the darkness seemed to press in on me, and the whispers grew louder, a cacophony of voices that filled the room. Just as I thought I would be consumed by the terror, the door gave way, and I stumbled out into the hallway, gasping for air. I looked back, half expecting to see something emerge from the shadows. But there was only silence and darkness. I retreated to my quarters, locking the door behind me. The safety of my room did little to ease my fear, the events of the night replaying in my mind. The whispers, the figure in the garden, the rocking chair. Were they real or just figments of my imagination, born from years of isolation and the oppressive atmosphere of the manor? I settled into a restless sleep, plagued by nightmares of shadowy figures and disembodied voices. When I awoke, the first rays of dawn were creeping through my window, casting a new light on the manor and banishing the terrors of the night. But the unease remained, a gnawing feeling in the pit of my stomach. Something was wrong in Winters Grove Manor, something ancient and malevolent. And I, Thomas Haverford, could not shake the feeling that it was only just beginning. The morning after the night of whispers and shadows brought no relief to my troubled mind. The manor, bathed in the pale light of dawn, seemed to mock my fears, its walls standing silent and unyielding. But the memory of the previous night's horrors lingered like a bad dream, refusing to be dismissed. With a heavy heart, I began my morning duties, the routine providing a small measure of comfort. The manor, however, felt different in the daylight. It was as if the house itself was holding its breath, waiting for night to fall once more. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes following my every move. As the day wore on, I decided to investigate the garden where I had seen the figure the night before. Bundling up against the cold, I stepped into the winter wasteland that surrounded the manor. The snow crunched under my feet, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent expanse. I made my way to the spot where I had seen the figure, but there was nothing there. No footprints, no sign of anyone or anything having been there. It was as if the snow had purposefully covered any trace, keeping its secrets hidden beneath a pristine white blanket. Confused and increasingly uneasy, I returned to the manor, my mind a whirlwind of questions with no answers. The rest of the day passed in a blur, my tasks performed mechanically, my thoughts elsewhere. As night fell once again, a sense of dread settled over me. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was going to happen, something inevitable and terrifying. Reluctantly, I began my nightly rounds, each step feeling heavier than the last. The house was even more oppressive at night, the shadows deeper, the silence more profound. I found myself jumping at the slightest noise, my nerves frayed to their breaking point. I reached the library, the site of the first whisper. The room was as I had left it, the books standing silent on their shelves. But as I turned to leave, I heard it again, the whisper, calling my name, Thomas. This time, it was accompanied by a cold breeze that made the candles flicker wildly. I spun around, searching for the source of the voice, but there was nothing there. A sense of panic began to rise in me, the walls of the library closing in. I rushed out, eager to escape the suffocating atmosphere. My next stop was the dining hall. The chandelier overhead was still, its crystals no longer casting their eerie light. I moved quickly through the room, eager to be done with my rounds. But as I reached the door, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. The clink of china, as if someone or something was setting the table. I turned, half expecting to see a ghostly banquet taking place, but the room was empty. The sound, however, continued, a maddening reminder that I was not alone in this house. The rest of my rounds were a nightmare of shadows and sounds. A door slamming shut on its own, the rustle of fabric, the feeling of being followed. By the time I reached the servants' quarters, I was a bundle of nerves. I hesitated at the door, remembering the rocking chair and the voices. Taking a deep breath, I pushed it open, bracing myself for what I might find. The room was as I had left it, the rocking chair still. But as I stepped inside, it began to move, slowly at first, then picking up speed. The air grew colder, and the whispers returned, louder and more insistent. "Thomas, leave this place." I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. But the door slammed shut behind me, plunging the room into darkness. The whispers grew to a cacophony, surrounding me, suffocating me. I felt hands on my back, pushing me towards the rocking chair. In a moment of sheer terror, I lashed out, my hands connecting with something solid. The whispers stopped abruptly, and the room fell silent. The door swung open, and I stumbled out, gasping for air. I ran to my quarters, locking the door behind me. I was shaking, my mind reeling from what had just happened. The manor was no longer just a house. It was a living, breathing entity, filled with malice and intent. That night, I lay awake, listening to the sounds of the house, the creaks, the groans, the whispers. I knew then that I could not stay in Winters Grove Manor any longer. The house wanted me gone, and I was all too eager to oblige. In the morning, I packed my few belongings, my hands still trembling. As I left the manor, I felt its gaze upon me, cold and unyielding. I didn't look back. Winters Grove Manor remained standing, a silent sentinel in the midst of a frozen wasteland. But I will never return, for I know now that some places are meant to be left alone, their secrets buried beneath layers of snow and silence. I've always thought of Elderwood Retirement Home as a sanctuary, a place of gentle twilight years, but that was before the winter that changed everything. I'm a nurse here, have been for the last 5 years. My days are filled with medication rounds, comforting chats, and the quiet, rhythmic ticking of the grandfather clock in the main hall. But it was one particularly cold December night when the air itself seemed to grow heavy with unspoken fears. It started with a whisper, not the kind you'd hear in a bustling hospital corridor, but a hushed, almost inaudible murmur, like a secret unwilling to fully reveal itself. I first heard it while doing my late-night rounds. The corridors, usually warm and inviting, felt unusually chilly despite the heating. I remember pulling my cardigan tighter around me as I checked on Mrs. Henderson, who was fast asleep, her breath forming small clouds in the dim light of her room. As I stepped out, the whisper came again, clearer this time, like a sigh lost in the winter wind. I paused, looking down the hallway. The only sound was the distant ticking of the clock and the soft, occasional creak of the old building settling. I convinced myself it was just my imagination, a trick of the mind from too many late nights. But as the nights grew colder, the whisper became a constant companion. I would hear it as I dispensed medications, soft and insistent. It seemed to emanate from the walls themselves, from the very air I breathed. The other staff joked about it being old Mr. Jacobs, who'd passed away last winter, not quite ready to leave. I laughed along, but unease nestled like a cold seed in my stomach. Then Mrs. Thompson went missing. She was a sprightly 80-year-old with a sharp wit and sharper memory. When I went to give her her evening medication, her room was empty, the window wide open, letting in a blast of icy air. Panic set in as we searched the home and the surrounding grounds. We found her an hour later in the old chapel, huddled by the altar, whispering to herself. Her words were nonsensical, a jumble of fear and pleading. She kept saying, the cold, it whispers back." We attributed it to a sudden onset of dementia, a not uncommon occurrence. But the seed of unease in me grew into a gnawing suspicion. The whispers continued, now a chorus of indistinct voices, always just at the edge of hearing. They seemed to grow in intensity as the cold deepened, as if feeding off the frost that etched the windows. One night, as I made my rounds, I noticed something odd. The grandfather clock in the main hall had stopped. Its once comforting tick-tock was silent, the hands frozen at midnight. The stillness was unsettling, like the calm before a storm. I moved to wind it, but stopped. The air felt different, charged, as if something was waiting, holding its breath. That's when I saw her, a figure at the end of the hallway. It was Mrs. Henderson, standing outside her room, staring into the darkness with wide, terrified eyes. I called out to her, but she didn't respond, just continued to stare. I approached, my footsteps muffled on the carpet. As I reached her, I saw what she was staring at. The corridor ahead was shrouded in shadows, deeper and darker than normal. But there was something in the darkness, a shape, a formless mass that seemed to undulate and shift. I felt a chill that had nothing to do with the winter air. My breath caught in my throat, and the whispering was all around us now. A cacophony of hushed voices, as if the shadows themselves were speaking. Mrs. Henderson turned to me, her eyes wide with fear. "It's here," she whispered, her voice trembling. "The cold, it's alive." I wanted to run, to scream, but my body wouldn't obey. The shadows seemed to reach out towards us, tendrils of darkness that writhed in the air. And then, just as suddenly, they receded. The normalcy of the hallway returned. The only evidence of the encounter, the pounding of my heart and Mrs. Henderson's terrified gaze. I escorted her back to her room, trying to convince myself it was just a trick of the light, a shared hallucination born of fatigue and stress. But the whispers didn't stop. They seemed to mock me now, a constant reminder that something unexplainable was happening at Elderwood. As the days passed, other residents began to act strangely. Mr. Laney, who hadn't walked in years, was found standing outside, staring at the frozen garden, his feet blue with cold. Little Annie, the cook's daughter, who often visited, claimed she heard voices calling her name from the basement. I tried to tell myself there was a logical explanation, that the building was old, its pipes and structure creating sounds that could be misconstrued. But the fear in the residents' eyes told a different story. They felt it too, the creeping dread, the sense that we were not alone, that the cold was more than just a lack of heat. It all came to a head one evening when the power went out during a particularly fierce snowstorm. The backup generators failed to kick in, plunging us into darkness. The howling wind and the groaning of the building melded with the whispering voices, creating a symphony of terror. Candles and flashlights did little to dispel the gloom that seemed to press in on us from all sides. I was helping Mr. Sinclair, one of our more frail residents, when I heard it. A scream, high and piercing, cutting through the din like a knife. It came from the direction of the main hall. I left Mr. Sinclair with a flashlight and hurried towards the sound, my heart racing. The main hall was in chaos. Residents huddled in groups, their faces ghostly pale in the flickering candlelight. And in the center of it all was Mrs. Jenkins, on the floor, her eyes wide with terror. She was pointing at the grandfather clock, the clock that had stopped ticking days ago. But now it was moving, the hands spinning wildly, faster and faster, as if time itself was unraveling. The whispering voices crescendoed, a deafening roar in my ears. And then, with a final ear-splitting crack, the clock stopped, the hands pointing to midnight once more. The silence that followed was oppressive, a heavy blanket smothering us all. I rushed to Mrs. Jenkins, but she was unresponsive, her eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. The other residents were similarly affected, their expressions vacant, as if they had witnessed something beyond comprehension. That night, as I sat in the dim light of the nurses' station, trying to make sense of what had happened, I realized that Elderwood was not just a retirement home. It was a place where the veil between worlds was thin, where the whispers of the past and the chill of the unseen could seep through. And as the winter deepened, as the cold wrapped its fingers tighter around the building, I knew that the whispers would grow louder, more insistent. Whatever was happening at Elderwood, it was far from over. It was just beginning. In the days following the incident with the clock, Elderwood became a place of hushed voices and fearful glances. The residents whispered about ghosts and curses, their words tinged with an ancient superstition that seemed out of place in our modern world. But I couldn't dismiss their fears, not after what I had seen. The winter grew harsher, the snow piling up against the windows, the wind howling like a banshee in the night. The cold seeped into every corner of Elderwood, an uninvited guest that refused to leave. The whispering was constant now, a low, incessant murmur that filled the halls, as if the building itself was alive with hidden conversations. One evening, as I was checking the locks on the windows, I saw something in the garden. It was a figure shrouded in the swirling snow, standing by the old oak tree. I blinked, and it was gone, leaving only the undisturbed snow in its wake. I told myself it was just a trick of the light, a shadow cast by the branches. But the image stayed with me, a lingering doubt that crept into my dreams. The residents' behavior became increasingly erratic. Mr. Browning, normally so calm and collected, began to wander the halls at night, muttering about a woman in white who called to him from the shadows. Little Annie refused to come to Elderwood, saying the bad voices scared her, and Mrs. Henderson, who had first seen the shadows in the hallway, became withdrawn, her eyes always darting to the corners of the room, as if expecting something to emerge. It was Mrs. Henderson who broke the fragile silence. One night, During a particularly fierce storm, she screamed. It was a primal, terrified sound that cut through the whispering and the howling wind. We found her in her room, her face pale, her eyes wide with horror. "They're here," she whispered, her voice hoarse. "The cold ones, the ones from the shadows. They're here." I tried to calm her, but her words sent a shiver down my spine. The cold ones. The term echoed in my mind, a label for the unseen terror that haunted Elderwood. The next day I found a book in the library, a dusty tome on local history. It mentioned an old legend, one that spoke of spirits of the winter, beings that rode the cold winds and whispered to the living. They were said to be harbingers of misfortune, their presence an omen of death and despair. I wanted to dismiss it as folklore, a story to explain the unexplainable, but the parallels were too striking, too close to what was happening at Elderwood. The whispers, the cold, the shadows in the night. It was as if the legend had come to life within the walls of the retirement home. Determined to find answers, I decided to keep a vigil. I stayed up through the night, watching the halls, listening to the whispers. It was in the deepest part of the night, when the world was still and the darkness seemed absolute, that I heard it, a different sound, a wail that rose above the whispering, mournful and haunting. I followed the sound to the main hall. The grandfather clock stood silent, its hands still pointing to midnight. But the air was different, charged with an energy that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. And then I saw them, the cold ones. They were like shadows given form, ethereal and translucent. They moved through the hall, their movements slow and deliberate, as if searching for something. Their whispers were clearer now, a language I couldn't understand, but the tone was unmistakable. Longing, sorrow, a yearning for something lost. I watched, frozen in place, as they drifted through the walls, disappearing into the fabric of the building. And in that moment I understood. Elderwood was their home, their sanctuary, just as it was for the residents. The retirement home was a crossroads, a place where the boundaries between worlds grew thin. As the sun began to rise, the cold ones vanished, leaving behind a silence that was more profound than the whispering had ever been. I knew then that they would return, that the winter would bring them back. But I also knew that Elderwood was more than just a retirement home. It was a place of mysteries, a place where the past and the present intertwined. I continued my work, caring for the residents, but with a new understanding. The cold ones were a part of Elderwood, a part of its history and its soul. And as the winter slowly gave way to spring, the whispering faded, the shadows receded, and the warmth returned. But the memory of that winter stayed with me, a reminder of the unseen world that exists just beyond our sight. Elderwood had revealed its secrets to me, and I knew that as long as I walked its halls, I would never be alone. The cold ones, the spirits of the winter, would always be there, whispering in the shadows, a part of the tapestry of life and death that made up the fabric of the retirement home. It was a cold December night, the kind that bites at your skin and reminds you you're alive, or at least that's what I like to tell myself. My name's Jack, a security guard at Oakwood High, a school that's seen better days. The job isn't glamorous, but it pays the bills. Night shifts are quiet, usually just me and the empty halls echoing with the ghost of daytime chatter. That night, something felt off. The air was too still, too quiet, even for a winter night. I started my rounds at 10 p.m., flashlight in hand, the beam cutting through the darkness like a knife. The school, an old, sprawling building, seemed more like a sleeping beast in the dim moonlight. As I walked down the main corridor, the usual creaks and groans of the old building were my only company. I checked the classrooms, peering through the windows, ensuring they were locked and empty. It was routine until I reached classroom 104. The door was slightly ajar, which was odd because I distinctly remembered locking it earlier. Pushing the door open, a cold draft hit me. The room was empty, but the window at the back was wide open, letting in the winter chill. I figured some kids might have snuck in for a dare and left in a hurry. I closed the window, locking it, and made a mental note to check the perimeter fence for holes. As I continued my patrol, the atmosphere started to feel heavier. My breaths formed foggy clouds in the air, and the silence seemed to press against my eardrums. I couldn't shake off the feeling of being watched. It was silly. I was the only one here after all. I decided to make a quick stop at the guard room to warm up. Inside, the small space heater was a welcome relief. I poured myself a coffee, the smell of it somehow comforting. The CCTV monitors lined one wall, showing different parts of the school. I scanned them out of habit. Everything seemed normal until I reached the camera showing the back of the school near the old gym. There was a figure standing in the snow, just at the edge of the camera's vision. It was hard to make out details, but it looked like a person, just standing there facing the school. My first thought was a trespasser, maybe a student up to no good. I downed my coffee and headed out, determined to do my job. The cold hit me like a slap as I stepped outside, my flashlight's beam bouncing ahead of me. I made my way to the back of the school, my boots crunching on the snow. But when I reached the spot, there was no one there, just an untouched blanket of snow. Confused, I checked the area thinking they might have run off, but there were no footprints, nothing to indicate someone had been there. A shiver ran down my spine, and it wasn't from the cold. I quickly headed back inside, trying to shake off the uneasy feeling. Back in the guard room, I checked the CCTV again. The figure was gone. I rubbed my eyes, wondering if the lack of sleep was messing with my head. The rest of my rounds were uneventful, but the feeling of unease grew. Every shadow seemed to stretch longer than it should. Every noise made me jump. I told myself it was just the winter night playing tricks on me. As I was passing by the school's old library, a noise stopped me dead in my tracks. It was a soft, muffled sound like someone crying. I pressed my ear against the door. The sound was definitely coming from inside. The library should have been empty and it was locked for the night. I fumbled for my keys, my hands shaking slightly. The lock clicked open and I pushed the door, the old hinges groaning. The room was shrouded in darkness, the only light coming from my flashlight. The crying had stopped. I stepped inside, my heart pounding in my chest. "Hello? Is anyone here?" I called out, my voice sounding strange in the quiet. There was no answer, just the sound of my own breathing. I walked between the aisles, the beam of my flashlight dancing over rows of books. That's when I saw it. A book lay open on the floor, its pages fluttering as if caught in a breeze. But there was no wind. I bent down to pick it up, and that's when I heard it. A whisper, so faint I thought I imagined it. "Leave." The voice was barely audible, a hissing breath that sent a chill down my spine. I looked around, but there was no one there. Just me and the whispering shadows. I dropped the book and hurried out of the library, locking the door behind me. My heart was racing and my rational mind was struggling to find an explanation. I made my way back to the guard room, trying to calm my nerves. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very wrong. I sat down, trying to process what had happened. The monitors showed the silent, empty halls of the school. Then, on the screen showing the main corridor, I saw it. A shadow moving across the wall. It was too big to be human, its form distorted and elongated. I stared at the screen, my blood turning cold. There was no one in the corridor, no one to cast that shadow. I stood up, a sense of dread washing over me. I had to check it out, it was my job. But every instinct was screaming at me to leave, to get out of this place. Taking a deep breath, I grabbed my flashlight and stepped out of the guard room. The corridors of Oakwood High had never felt so menacing. The shadows never so alive. I walked towards the main corridor, each step feeling heavier than the last. As I rounded the corner, the flashlight's beam cut through the darkness. The corridor was empty. No shadow, no movement, just the eerie silence of the night. I stood there, my heart pounding, waiting for something to happen. But there was nothing, just the oppressive stillness of the school at night. I didn't realize I was holding my breath until I let it out in a shudder. Maybe it was just a trick of the light, a glitch in the camera. I had to keep it together. I couldn't let my imagination get the best of me. I made my way back to the guard room, my steps quick and uneasy. I had to stay awake, stay alert. But deep down, I knew something was very wrong in Oakwood High that night. The shadows seemed to watch me as I walked, the silence a heavy cloak around my shoulders. I settled back into the guard room, keeping an eye on the monitors. The rest of the night passed slowly, every tick of the clock stretching longer than the last. I couldn't shake the feeling of dread, the sense that something was lurking just out of sight, watching, waiting. As dawn approached, the school began to wake up, the darkness receding with the light. I finished my shift, more relieved than I cared to admit. But as I left Oakwood High, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, that the school was no longer just an old building, but something else, something darker. I told myself I'd return the next night, do my job like always. But as I walked away from the school, the first rays of sunlight breaking through the clouds, I couldn't help but feel a sense of foreboding, a whisper in the back of my mind that something was waiting for me in the shadows of Oakwood High. The next night, I returned to Oakwood High with a sense of trepidation. The events of the previous night lingered in my mind like a bad dream. The winter night greeted me with its usual icy embrace, but this time, it felt more menacing, as if the cold had a grip on my very soul. I started my rounds with a heavy heart, the flashlight my only companion in the dark, silent halls. Every creak of the old building, every whisper of wind set my nerves on edge. I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched, of unseen eyes following my every move. As I passed the library, I hesitated. The memory of the whisper and the open book was still fresh in my mind. I pushed the door open, half expecting to hear the voice again. But there was only silence. The book was no longer on the floor, everything was as it should be. I quickly moved on, eager to leave the oppressive atmosphere of the library behind. Making my way to the main corridor, I kept an eye on the shadows, half expecting to see the distorted form again. But there was nothing, just the empty hall stretching before me. I tried to convince myself that what I had seen was just a trick of the light, a figment of my imagination. I reached the guard room and settled in, keeping a wary eye on the CCTV monitors. The screens showed the usual empty corridors and classrooms, the stillness of the school almost suffocating. I couldn't help but feel trapped, like a rat in a maze with no way out. Hours passed, each minute stretching into an eternity. I tried to stay focused, to keep my mind from wandering to dark places. But the sense of dread was growing, a tangible presence in the room with me. Then, on the monitor showing the gym, I saw it. A door slowly opening by itself. I stared at the screen, my heart racing. There was no logical explanation, no reason for the door to move on its own. I knew I had to investigate. It was my job after all, but every fiber of my being screamed at me to stay put, to not venture into the darkness. I took a deep breath and stood up, my legs feeling like lead. As I made my way to the gym, the silence of the school was oppressive, the darkness a living thing that enveloped me. I reached the gym door, which was now wide open. I shone my flashlight inside, the beam cutting through the gloom. The gym was empty, the bleachers casting long, eerie shadows on the floor. I stepped inside, my footsteps echoing in the vast space. I scanned the room, looking for any sign of disturbance, but there was nothing out of place. Then I heard it, a soft, barely audible giggle, like that of a child. It seemed to come from all around me, echoing off the walls. I spun around, my flashlight beam darting across the room. But there was no one there, just the empty gym and the mocking echoes of the giggle. Panic started to set in, a cold, clawing feeling in the pit of my stomach. I turned to leave, but stopped dead in my tracks. The door I had come through was now closed. I rushed to it, tugging at the handle, but it wouldn't budge. I was trapped. I banged on the door, shouting for help, but my voice was swallowed by the vastness of the gym. I was alone, utterly alone. The realization hit me like a physical blow, and I slumped against the door, my mind racing. Then the lights went out. I was plunged into darkness, the only light coming from my flashlight. I flicked the beam around the gym, the shadows seeming to dance and twist in the light. I felt a rising sense of panic, a primal fear of the dark and the unknown. I had to get out, had to escape this nightmare. I made my way to the other end of the gym, hoping to find another way out. My flashlight flickered, the battery dying, and I felt a surge of terror. I was going to be left in the dark, alone with whatever was in the gym with me. I reached the other door, and to my relief, it opened. I stumbled out into the corridor, the sudden silence deafening after the echoes of the gym. I didn't stop to look back, just ran, my only thought to get away from that place. I made it back to the guard room, locking the door behind me. I collapsed into the chair, my whole body shaking. I couldn't understand what was happening, couldn't make sense of the terror that had gripped the school. I sat there, watching the sunrise on the monitors, the light bringing a sense of normalcy back to the world. But the events of the night had changed something in me. I knew I couldn't come back to Oakwood High, couldn't face the shadows and the whispers again. As I left the school for the last time, the sun rising in the sky, I felt a sense of relief, but also of loss. I had lost a part of myself in those dark halls, a part that I would never get back. Oakwood High was no longer just a building to me. It was a place of darkness, of unexplained horrors that lurked in the shadows, waiting for the night to fall. If you enjoyed this video, please give us a like and please subscribe. Your support will help us tremendously. Thank you.